Well, good afternoon and evening, everybody. My name is Greg Goodland. I'm the Forest Public Affairs Officer for the Rio Grande National Forest, and welcome to the Forest Specialist Series. We got a great program tonight lined up. I'm really excited about this one myself. The cranes are just an amazing bird to me, and I cannot wait to learn more. So we've got just a couple of things we need to do before we get there. And I'd like to introduce my host, co-host, and the operations manager of this Zoom thing. We'll call that Kelly Defy with San Juan Mountains Association. Kelly, take it away.
Okay, well, we're just going to do the quick housekeeping. We ask everybody to stay on mute unless you've got a question. You can ask a question by raising your hand. It's down there, down in the whatever, the ribbon down at the bottom. You can also put it into the chat. Let's see what else. We do have a door prize. I've got it here. It's a book called Still Following the Feathered and the Fouled. Sorry, I don't know if you can catch it with my blur. It's a book by Evelyn Horn. She's done a lot of she's bird watching. She's I don't know. She has a lot of stories about her experiences bird following birds and seeking out different species and things. So there's actually a section in there about the Monte Vista and the cranes. So I thought that would be an appropriate door prize. So if you want to be put into the door prize, put your name in the chat and I'll get you into that. And then, so now I believe that's all the housekeeping. So we'd like to have,
Hey, Kelly, you might just advise folks of how they can chat to you or
oh, yes. If you guys want to be on the newsletter, you can send me your email you can send a personal chat message to me by clicking on the arrow next to the everyone in the chat button in the chat window. And then find me under, I'm SJMA, San Juan Mountains Association. So that way you can send me just your email and I'll get you on our newsletter if you're not already there. Have I forgotten anything else? Okay. All right. Well, we're going to turn the time now to Suzanne Beauchaine, our specialist for this month, and we'll let you introduce yourself better.
Awesome. Thank you. I guess let's just start sharing and then I'll introduce myself. See if this works again. See my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yeah, you're sharing.
Okay, great. Sorry. It's been a long time since I've done a PowerPoint, so oh my, there it is. Okay, so thank you everybody for inviting me. This is going to be, I hope it's going to be fun. And I'm really glad, Greg, you asked about where people are coming from, because I might have to adjust some of the stuff we talk about depending on how, do folks know how to do the little react? It's like, how many people have been to the San Luis Valley and or Monte Vista Refuge? Because almost all of you are out of the valley. It's really kind of exciting. It's like, I know those, you two. So not too many, a few. All right, well, we will talk about, I'll probably have to add a few things. But I'm Suzanne Beauchaine. I'm the Refuge Manager for Alamosa and Monte Vista National Wildlife Refuge. I've actually been in the valley for 12 years now, almost 13. And I do apologize in advance. I'm recovering from COVID, so I'm congested. Hopefully I won't start coughing. It's like Kelly and Greg are also fighting something too. So we're a triplet pair here of coughing and sniffles and everything. So hopefully my voice will last. And as we talked about, we're going to talk all about cranes. So a quick overview, we'll talk about how ancient these birds are. We're definitely going to talk about our cranes that come to the valley. We'll go over migration, the habitat needs in the valley, and kind of elsewhere too. And then a lot of the daily life, especially if you get a chance to come down to visit Monte Vista, There'll be some nice hints. We'll go over some of the biology and some of the behaviors that you might see when you're watching cranes. So these cranes they're just ancient birds. There's the petroglyph that's shown here is actually in the valley. It's up on private land close to Del Norte. And they estimate that the petroglyph is about 3,000 to 4,000 years old. So sandhill cranes have been coming to this valley for tens of thousands of years. We have some really amazing archaeological sites in the valley that have mammoth and camel, Pleistocene horse, bison, and so there's been a lot of wildlife use and human use in this valley for very, very long time. But the sandhill cranes are actually the oldest living fossil, basically. They're the oldest bird in the world. So the closest relative, they found a fossil in Florida that's 2.5 million years old. And more recently, there was an older one. Apparently, it's not a sandhill crane, but it's a very closely related crowned crane that's 10 million years old out of Nebraska in the Sandhills, which is kind of cool because that's where a lot of the sandhill cranes will be there too. Worldwide, there's actually not that many crane species. There's only 15. And of those, 4 of them are endangered. We have 2 species in North America. We have the sandhill crane and then the whooping crane. The whooping crane is one of them that's endangered. And then sandhill cranes are doing great. They're not vulnerable or anything. And then there's 7 species that are vulnerable. So almost all of the cranes worldwide are struggling in one way or the other. All right, I'm gonna hope this works. Somebody give me a thumbs up if you start to hear it, because I might have to do another setting change. All right. I know that many people that I've met over the years being here and myself, that noise is so primordial and ancient. And for me, it's really has the seasons of change. It's like this is the time of year that they're coming back into the San Luis Valley in their migration. And they're doing like the same thing that our farmers are doing. They're harvesting their fields, they're getting ready for winter. We're harvesting our vegetable gardens, we're getting wood for the winter, we're stocking up, and the birds and the other wildlife. So bears, definitely the sandhill cranes, pika, they're all doing the same thing. So it's that season of change. And then when we hear that same call in the spring, it just sends goosebumps down my arms. It just never gets old. And it's a question I've actually asked on most of our bus trips. If you guys want to put it in the chat, has anybody never seen a sandhill crane before? You guys are definitely scattered all over the place. Usually on our bus trips, during the spring crane festival in Monte Vista, I asked that of our bus tours, and almost a third of the people have never seen or heard a sandhill crane before. So if you guys know how to do your chat, I would love to hear from folks if you've never seen one. But it's just such an amazing sound. Whoops. Again. There we go. So we'll talk about our cranes a little bit. So there are several subspecies of sandhill cranes in North America. So the population that we're most concerned with here in the valley in Colorado is the greater sandhill crane. And we'll look at some of the differences in a couple of slides from here. And then this is actually the Rocky Mountain population. So we're in yellow. And can you guys see my mouse pointer? Somebody give me a thumbs up. or do I have to do? Okay, great. Thanks, Greg. So this little dot is the San Luis Valley. So the one subspecies of the greater Sandhill crane, and those include the Pacific Coast population, the Central Valley, and then the lower Colorado River population. So these are all greater Sandhill cranes over here. And we'll talk about those differences. And then the gray, and then the orange, and the Central Flyway, and then the Eastern Flyway. These are all lessers. And then there's 3 populations, subspecies that are non-migratory. And they're much smaller populations. There's the Mississippi, Cuban, and Florida. There's little populations in those 3 areas that don't migrate. They're not doing that great. I think the Cuban population is actually might be endangered. But so this is their basically where they're wintering during migration, and then their summer habitats. So for our Rocky Mountain populations, and we'll look at a different map too, but they come down into the San Luis Valley in the spring and in the fall, both ends of migration, and they pile all into the valley. It's really a special place. So in the lesser population, some of you may have been to Nebraska, the Rainwater Basin area, to see the lessers migrate, and they all pile into this area in Nebraska. So that's another spectacular area to go visit. And these areas that they're stopping over for a long period of time. So the scientists have figured out the different populations. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who I work for, we have a migratory bird program, and they actually have a Rocky Mountain population of the greater Sandhill cranes management plan, and it shoots for a population between 20 and 25,000 birds. And last year they were doing actually better than that. And they're doing this fall staging counts right now. So we'll have that numbers for folks next spring, but they're doing really well. But all the graders together number about 70,000 birds. Versus the lessers, they actually number 1.2 million birds. So there's a lot more of them. And we do get the lessers in our population. So especially during wintering and in the spring migration and fall migration, we will have both lessers and graders, but just a few thousand. I mean, that million birds, they all go to Rainwater Basin. It's pretty amazing. So this is something that a lot of people you see out in the field, and people mistake the lessers for the young of the graders because they're smaller. So it's a really easy way to tell the difference between the subspecies, which this picture shows it perfectly. They're right next to each other, and one's just a monster and the other one's small. So they do differ in about a foot size, definitely heavier, the graders. And when you see them next to each other, their heads and their bills are just much more massive than these little guys. It is deceiving though, because you'll see lessers maybe all together, and they're still large birds. So don't get me wrong, the lessers are still huge, but it's a interesting thing when you can see them next to each other out on Monte Vista Refuge. All right, so this map is pretty cool. It's from a recent study. I actually can't see the date. There it is. From 2014 to 2020, some researchers and the Fish and Wildlife Service Migratory Bird Program radio collared with GPS collars 108 sandhill cranes in those 3 different populations to actually track exactly where they're going and if there was some intermixing between those populations, which there was a little bit. But it just really shows our Rocky Mountain population is in blue on the right-hand side here. And it shows exactly where they're wintering in New Mexico, Mexico, and Arizona. And then here's the valley. They're all piling in both times a year, spring and the fall. And then in the summertime, this is where they nest, basically in the greater Yellowstone area. So right now, the fall peak numbers will be second or third week of October. So it's a little bit later, and they're staying later every year. So when they leave here, they go down to along the Rio Grande, definitely down to Bosque del Apache Refuge. And they do have a big festival, and they've moved it to December because the birds haven't been leaving the valley because it's been so warm the last 10 years or so. And then when they come back in the spring, they start trickling in mid-February, and they'll pretty much all be gone by the end of April. And so the peak season to see them here in the valley is the first, second, third week of March. And our Crane Festival is the second weekend in March. I think it's the 8th, 9th, and 10th next year. And then again, they breed up in the greater Yellowstone area. And there is a small population in Steamboat that are breeding. And most of you probably do know that birds migrate, and why they migrate is because they're just definitely taking advantage of the resources during the summer months when there's a lot more habitat to be able to breed. There's food available in wetlands, and so it's really important and a very dangerous thing to do. So in part, actually a lot of why the National Wildlife Refuge System is in place, we were established in 1903. And basically, we were established for migratory birds. We do protect a lot of other wildlife species, but it was really established for protecting those birds throughout their whole life cycle. So there's a whole network of lands and waters throughout the whole country and in a couple of territories trying to protect all those migration, breeding, wintering areas. So that's really what the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Wildlife Refuge System, does. And some of you might not know that we actually have 3 refuges in the valley. So we have the Baca, Monte Vista, and Alamosa National Wildlife Refuges. So this slide, basically what they need in the valley, it's pretty specific to the valley because they still do feed on natural areas, and especially where they're breeding, they're not so tied to agriculture as much in some areas, but what they really do need in this valley is shallow wetlands where they do feed, they roost, and they loaf in. And we'll talk about those in a little bit. But they also need, with all the changes that has happened in the valley over the last 150 years, they really have come to depend on those small grain farm fields that are pretty close to those wetland complexes. We actually have several partners, especially this time of year. There's more wetlands available throughout the valley. There's state wildlife areas, Russell Lakes, along the river. They will definitely use to feed and roost on. Park Service, they'll have cranes over there because they've got some nice wetlands, but they need some food that's not that far away, so they're not spending all their energy flying too far to go get some food. So it's really important, and part of that study, well, we've done a couple of studies in the valley recently that have linked that importance of the agricultural sustained wetlands, especially like this area is called Rock Creek, and this is just flood irrigated hay meadows. And it can be really important when the cranes or other wildlife are in the valley migrating for food and um, and for nesting too. So we definitely depend on a lot of the working landscapes around the refuge. They're really vital for sustaining that network of stopover sites for migratory birds, and that's really through the whole country. So on the refuge, we actually have farming going on. Excuse me. So what the birds are looking for, if you see all these circles, these are our farm fields. So this is about where the refuge is, the refuge proper. So this one's our farm field. This one is too, and this one is too. So you can see ours are like half and half. So we actually have permittees that have special use permits that pay a fee to farm these fields, and our goal is to do half of it in barley, and the other half they typically do in alfalfa, and they have to do all the work. So they have to prep the fields, they have to plant the crops, they have to pay for the water because we do have to pump water for irrigating the farm fields. But the difference is in the fall, we don't mow our farm fields. So right now, the farmers just harvested all their barley. So there's actually plenty of grain out there for the birds in the fall. And the barley fields will be the ones that are in brown. So the birds are looking for the small grain, and the green fields are actually alfalfa. So they're looking for these that are brown. They might be canola. They might be some winter wheat. There's not a lot of that grown in the valley. Most of the barley, there's a lot of barley grown in the valley. About 40,000 acres are under contract with Coors. So it's almost all for beer in the valley. So they're going to be utilizing a lot of the farm fields because there's waste grain left in the fields after harvest. But for the refuge, we're growing the grain too, but we're more concerned about spring migration when they really need to be in really good shape to get up to their nesting territory, start defending that nest again, and producing eggs. So we leave the grain standing over the fall and the winter. So the birds in the fall don't go to our farm fields until spring. We have to mow the farm fields in the spring. So that's why they're really concentrated in the spring, because potentially there's definitely less grain on the private land. They still will be out on the private land fields, but if it snows, there's no food available. We actually go and plow our farm fields in the spring just to keep some of the grain available for them if we do get a big snowstorm. Because it can be 20 below when these birds are here. They're tough birds. So this is some of the they're very predictable in a lot of ways. So this is some of the places where you can go see them on the refuge, or if you find another spot on Russell Lakes or something. But this is their pattern throughout the day. And I picked we're going to start at night. So they definitely need shallow wetlands at night that provide a lot of protection from predators, and they provide warmth. So on the refuge, we have several wetlands that they can roost in, and a couple of them are right on the wildlife drive. So it's really fun watching them because they'll preserve their heat loss by standing on one leg. Maybe everybody has seen that with birds. When it gets really cold, they fluff up. And then the water also holds heat better than air. It's like, I didn't really understand that until I got here. And then birds also have a crazy um, biological thing going on. It's like, if we were sitting in some water, freezing water, we would die, right? But their feet don't even freeze. So they have this counter current heat exchange. So the vessels in their feet and legs are really close together. So the hotter blood coming out of their body warms up the colder coming from their foot. So they don't have any issues with their feet freezing or that cold blood coming back up to the heart. It's another really cool adaptation for birds. And we do have a couple of really nice roosting spots that you can watch them fly in or fly out in the morning. We are open until 1 hour after sunset. So, but we are closed at night if anybody gets a chance to come down. So then at sunrise the next morning, they will leave the wetlands. And I love this picture. It's from Nebraska, but I've not really seen them fly out in a big fly out in the mornings. They usually just kind of start leaving smaller groups. And if you get there early enough, because they're leaving the roosting areas to go out to the nearby grain fields to go feed for a couple hours. So if you can get on the wildlife drive, you got to get there before sunrise, like 15, 20 minutes before, especially if it's warm. If it's colder, sunrise might be okay. because I was out there on Monday to see how many birds were out there, and I could see them flying before I even got to the refuge. It's like, oh, I'm too late. Because then you can watch them wake up. It's really quiet usually. If it's cold, their feet will have frozen into the ice, and you can hear them breaking the ice. It's really cool. And then they kind of leave in smaller groups, and then they get really loud. So it's another fun time to go see them. So as I said, they go off and feed, and here's our farm fields. So both of these are from a spring picture, but this field hasn't been mowed yet. And so they're hanging out on the edge. They won't go into the field in the fall when it's not mowed. And I don't know why, but it makes sense that barley has been produced to keep the seed on its seed head so you can run a harvester through it. A natural plant would have lost its seeds. You can't reproduce if you keep your seeds on your seed head. So I'm thinking that's why the cranes, you don't ever see them in the fall, hardly ever in our farm fields. So they're hanging out on the edge, or they'll go find a field that's been mowed, like this one. And these are fun behaviors. This is part of their dancing. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So they do this, they feed in the morning right at sunrise, and then they'll do it again a couple hours before sunset. And then I don't know about you guys, but what do you do after a good meal? So we call it loafing. That's exactly what the cranes will go do. So they'll feed a couple hours in the morning and the evening, and then they'll go loaf. And what does that mean? I have seen the birds stay on farm fields all day long if it's really cold or storming, and they're just trying to keep that energy intake going. But a lot of times it's gorgeous, like today. So they might be out, they might go back to the wetlands. They'll potentially hit the thermals. Oh, I forgot to talk about that because that's how they migrate too. But a lot of times you'll just see them in the thermals when the ground starts to heat up during the day. Like when you see a dust devil, that's a thermal forming. And that's how they migrate because they have these massive wings and they don't need to flap. They can fly into the thermal and you can see them all the way up in the sky until you can't see the bird anymore. So in this big spiral. And basically when the thermal gets to high enough elevation that it cools off and it kind of disappears, that's when they can start migrating. So they go north and south on thermals. So they actually have to migrate during the day. Most of our songbirds and other birds migrate at night, actually. So it's kind of unique that the cranes migrate during the day. So yeah, they'll be dancing. They might just rest. They might keep eating. And a lot of times I think they're just playing in the thermals because they're here for 2 months in the spring and the fall. So it's a nice opportunity to see a whole bunch of different behaviors. And then one of my favorite times in the fall is to be back on the wildlife drive, especially on our southern pond. We have a little old boardwalk there. You can sit there and you have to hang out until after sunset. And then you just start seeing birds coming in from the south and the north, just in these skeins. It's a really cool time. And there's not a lot of people that come down here in the fall. And you can still see some spectacular viewing. So some of the other biology on the cranes include when they go up to their nesting area, and I'm assuming this crane is sitting on a nest, they build these large mounds in a wetland. So there could be a potential they get flooded out, but it's also another predator. They can hear the predators coming in. And a lot of times they come back to the same mound. Same birds come back to the same territories. But unlike now, when you'll see 1,000 birds together, they don't want to see another pair of cranes anywhere. So they need these huge areas of really healthy shallow wetlands to breed. And they usually have 2 eggs, and the birds are called colts, these little guys. Basically, they're fluff balls with really long legs. It's a great name for them. And they're precocial, which actually means their eyes are open, they've got fluff, and they're up and running within 24 hours of being hatched. So they are ready to move. They usually come back to the nest at night though, when they're really, really young. But typically only one colt will actually fledge. There's just a lot of predators that can get these little flightless guys, but the adults are very, very good parents. There's actually not a lot of predators that can catch a full grown adult that's healthy. Bald eagles and golden eagles are definitely two of their top predators, but unless they're injured, coyotes aren't a threat, wolves aren't a threat, bears aren't really a threat. But when they're sitting on a nest, the eggs are definitely very, very vulnerable, and the chicks are definitely very vulnerable, but they're pretty also really good parents, so they're really good at defending their young. And we talked a little bit about what they eat, and they're definitely focusing on small grains when they're in the valley, but they also eat everything else. So they eat insects, worms, snakes, birds' eggs, small mammals, frogs, wetland plants. They are just omnivorous. They really just eat anything. And they're really long lived. So they live to be 20 to 30 years old in the wild. I think I read there's a bird in captivity that's 82 years old. That's incredible. The family groups stay together throughout the winter. So this time of year, you will see the juveniles with the parents. Excuse me. And here's one of the juvenile pictures. So you can tell the difference because their eye is still brown and they don't have the red patch of skin. This is actually skin on the adult's head. And they can send more blood to that area when they're mating or if they're in a fight. And that can get bigger. But the juveniles won't have that red patch until they're 3 to 4 years old, because they don't actually form a lifelong pair bond with another mate until they're an adult. So it takes them 4 to 5 years to reach that adult age. So when they so they stay with the parents all winter, they'll migrate back up to the nesting area, but then the parents will start kicking them out in the spring. Actually, when they're in the valley, you'll start seeing adults chasing the juvenile to get away. The juvenile will probably still go back up with the family group, but then they'll break off with the other bachelors or bachelorettes and hang out, do other stuff, because they can't hang out in the territory anymore. So they will get kicked out of the family group in the spring. When they are flying, when they hit those thermals and start migrating, they go 25 to 35 miles per hour, and they can travel 200 to 300 miles per day. It's average. I guess they've tracked birds going further than that, but they need a lot of barley to do that. So it's pretty amazing thing in migration. So some of the fun behaviors, like if you're down here for Crane Festival, oh, yeah, that's weird. There's actually a crane behavior dictionary. My screen can't pick it up. Our friends group sells this every spring. So it's really fun because you can be out there going, oh, that's what they're doing. Oh, that's interesting. So some biologists over the years have watched the birds long enough. They think they know what happens when they're doing these dances, because they're reforming their pair bonds when they're doing these joyful dances, and they're throwing vegetation up in the air and they're catching it. Their partner catches it. It's just amazing different displays that they have. Or you can also kind of start picking up, is that a young one getting chased, or is that a competitor trying to get into the food area or something? And so can be either for forming your pair bond or fighting somebody. So it's kind of fascinating to be able to watch them. And it's a great spot to be able to watch the birds do that because they're in those larger groups. And that's felt like really fast, but that's all I really have. So if you have any questions.
I could never find my mouse to turn off the audio and video at that point, Suzanne. That was
Right.
amazing. And I have a question. I'm going to ask the first one, but there's another one in the chat. But
Okay. Let me open up that
the
link.
question I have is, what happens if the population increases more than this target? Like I think you said 20,000 for this Rocky Mountain um, herd. What is it? Flock?
Block. Block, I think, is the general term we talk about birds. Um, the population, those numbers have been really consistent for decades. So I guess the bigger concern for us, we've been thinking about what happens if more lessers start using this flyway. So that's the competition that we're a little bit worried. We don't see because it's so much limited on the breeding ground. There's just not that much wetland area because they need like 200 acres per nest. That's huge
Oh,
area. Yeah, it's a huge area, and that's usually all wetlands. So it's really limited on where they're nesting. So I don't think we're really worried about the graders increasing too much for what's available in the valley. Um, but we have talked a little bit about it. It's like, well, what if more lessers keep coming here? What if there ends up being 20,000 lessers also? That could be a concern. So we haven't really worked through any of that, but it's definitely a concern.
yeah, fair enough. I mean that, obviously I know some things about species management, so it's just, how do you tell them to not have as many babies or something? That's
Right. And when you start having a different population that's doing really well, that competition might impact that population. And I mean, there are efforts from some of our land trusts that work in the state and in the valley, our Rio Grande Headwaters Land Trust, Colorado Open Lands. They've been trying to work with private landowners to do conservation easements, which protects that working ranch from subdivisions. The landowner actually gets a really good tax break and gets cash. So it's a really good incentive to protect a really important piece of wildlife habitat because refuges can't protect everything. Public land can't protect everything. It's like most of the most important habitats on private land. So when we have folks that are um, willing to do that, which actually makes less taxes for their heirs to come stay on the farm, stay on the ranch, that's really important. Plus, there's efforts to potentially pay farmers to leave some grain on those farm fields. So kind of ensuring that there is enough for the spring.
right.
So we might have to work at that harder. I don't know. It's
They leave
and
more
with
grain, huh?
yeah, with water changing, it's another huge challenge.
All right, well, let's step back and go to the chat. And David asked the question, does the group in southern New Mexico stay put or migrate?
They migrate. So partly in southern New Mexico. So all of our graders will go in that area. They might go into Arizona and New Mexico too. But I think the most of the population in the winter stays in uh, the New Mexico area for the winter. But all those birds will move. They all migrate out. So that I don't think there's any birds that have stayed year round in New Mexico. Not that I've heard. And if you remember that map, the graders and lessers all mix together down in New Mexico in the wintertime.
Which is absolutely crazy. That's a lot
Yeah,
of birds. So let's go to the
it,
next one.
it's a
David
lot.
also said that one, Suzanne, and he says, could you explain how they make their noise? I've heard the bones in the
Oh
throat.
man, David, you're asking a hard question. Um, what I understand of their trachea, I don't think it's their bones. I mean, we have a voice box, right? That's not bone, right?
No.
Yeah, that's a hard question. But I do know that the trachea is like really long. It's not it's not just the length of their neck, it's like even longer. So all right, well, I'll have to look on how birds make noises because they're all so different and they're all so complicated. Um, but I don't think it's bones. I think it's just the length of their trachea and then however their voice boxes are.
Let me ask a further question. I don't know what you used as the noise, a term for the noise. I would call it a chortle of sort.
Chortle.
What is it called? Is it called something in particular?
Uh, Mostly it's calls. There are different like positions. uh, Well, partly in the um, there's a unison call, a location call. Um, and whether when you're hearing them fly, it's like maybe
Mhm.
they're doing the location call. If have you guys heard? It's like the chortle. That's a great description. As a birder, we do try to put words on it. I've never heard like a yellow warbler. It's sweet, sweet. I'm so sweet.
Right.
It's a or who cooks for you? The barred owl. We try to put like a sentence. It's easier to remember too. But I've never heard anybody say, "Oh, it sounds like this." But yeah, it's a and a chortle. I like that description. So, and there's different noises that they make because when you hear this, when you're out in the field and there's like a high pitched, kind of like a cry or a whistle, that's a juvenile. It's like I don't think the adults do that other little whistle thing. It's just this really high pitched whistle thing. So it's like that's a juvenile. The adults do the chortling or the unison call. So yeah, usually we just say song or a call. I don't think these guys have songs per se, versus a lot of the songbirds, they actually have a song, then they have a call. But
Well, I love their call, whatever you want to call it. So, hey, Brandon just put in there, and that's Brandon is our wildlife biologist on the SWAT Ranger District. He put in the
oh,
chat. Can you read that, Suzanne?
let's answer Jay's first. So how many pairs do you estimate produce fledglings at Monte Vista each year? So they actually don't nest, sorry, they don't nest in the valley. So they leave the valley in April to go up to the greater Yellowstone area to breed. So the fledglings, that's what they're doing right now, the biologists for the Fish and Wildlife Service. They're counting the fall staging um, counts. So there's biologists throughout that whole flyway. So from Montana down to New Mexico, they're counting where the cranes are at and then looking at counting juveniles of the graders. And that's how they're estimating that full population. Um, so I don't know if, well, they should have that split out in that data when we get that. So it's happening right now, so we won't get those numbers until later this winter. So I don't actually have numbers. It's basically that population objective is around 20 to 25,000 birds. So that's the bigger number that they're looking for, not just how many fledglings are being produced. I guess that's kind of similar to what Brandon asked.
Well,
Um,
I was looking down on before the other one that Brandon put in there, but as long as we're talking that population, I mean, how are they doing that? By like
did I
flyover?
miss that? No, people are on the ground doing same transects every year.
No kidding.
Yep. So it's kind of been over the decades of knowing where they're typically at, and then however they set up the transects, and it's basically on the roads. I'm not sure about more remote places like where I just came from before here was Red Rock Lakes Refuge in Montana. That's a 60,000 acre wilderness area out in a huge wetland. So, but by this time of year, they might have left or they're congregating in the uplands better. So it's basically just that, well, it's population estimate along different transects throughout the entire flyway. And is this being, did I miss another one from Brandon? I see
Yeah, and then we
let's
had
see
the
how
other
to,
one, but as long as we'll just go right down the list there, and let's talk about that Layla one. I think it's Layla. Sorry if I've stated that wrong. You stated that the bald eagles and the golden eagles were predators. What about coyotes?
coyotes can be, but for the most part, unless the cranes are injured, coyotes can't catch them. They'll just fly away, or they can probably highly injure a coyote too with their bill and their wings. I mean, geese can break legs of predators. They're so strong. So the cranes are really strong. So they pretty much need to be unhealthy to for a coyote, for a ground predator to catch them. But the babies, yeah, the babies, the eggs. Coyotes don't really focus on nests, but fox and mink and otter and raccoon, skunk. There's a lot of stuff that'll eat the eggs and the babies. So coyotes could easily catch a colt if the parents weren't paying attention for, or if there was a bigger pack and they had too many coyotes to protect the babies from. So that could happen. But the adults, that'd be tough to take down. Oh, look, thanks, Brandon. You answered our voice box. So if everybody can't see the chat, it's called the syrinx. Am I saying that right? In birds, is the voice box. And it's controlled by 9 muscles versus the human larynx only has 2. Nice. So there's much more control of the sound produced. And I know it has something to do with that length of the larynx too. Thank you, Brandon, for that answer.
That's awesome. Well, certainly, you guys, we love this interactive. So for those of you out there, let's ask some questions. We got her. She's going to go away in a few minutes, so let's not let that happen without getting our questions answered. And one more time, I'll put a plug in if you'd like to be included in the drawing for the door prize, that cool book that Kelly brought up. Please go ahead and shoot your name into the chat or directly chat to her, and in just a few minutes, she'll draw that door prize.
I can tell Kelly's not a birder because we're kind of an unusual bunch. We do strange things when you're going birding.
How so?
Just it's you're looking at every single little flit, and then so you might go on a hike, but you only go 100 yards in 3 hours because you're just identifying all the birds. It can be pretty entertaining watching birders. Oh, Patty has a good question. It's like after they hatch, how long does it take till they fly? I'm pretty sure it takes 3 months for them to grow to pretty much the same size as the adult and get their flight feathers. So it's 2 to 3 months before they fledge. So it's kind of a long time. So they have to get up, nest really quick, and get those birds growing. Because most birds, even the bigger birds, they sit on eggs for about 30 days. um, like my dogs just came in. Lisa has a question. How many birds are in Alaska? I've heard and seen them more than once run outside with the grandkids. Well, in Alaska, you've got all the lessers up there, And I know there's a lot of lessers that go up there to nest. I don't know exactly the number that actually would be nesting in Alaska. I used to work one summer up at Cape Krusenstern National Monument, north of Nome, north of the Seward Peninsula, on the Chukchi Sea. We arrived May 10th on a plane in a snowstorm. The ocean was frozen. We were able to go across the ocean, the inlet, about a week later after the snowstorm, and there was lesser sandhill cranes on these little tiny tussocks that were melting out of the snow, and they were breeding, trying to nest already, and it was just solid ice still. So, and so I don't know the numbers, but there are uh, cranes pretty much throughout Alaska. Probably not in the forested areas, but if there's open wetlands around the forested taiga areas, they'll be there.
Which I'm sure there are plenty in Alaska that I was too. So right on. Well, any more questions? You certainly feel free to put them in the chat or just come online and ask your question.
Yeah.
If you guys can hear my clock ringing in the background, I'm glad.
Or my panting dog.
Well, Kelly, you just came up. Awesome. Why don't we do the drawing here and we can allow folks to contemplate a couple more questions before we cut everybody loose.
All right, well, it was Layla that won today. So Layla, if you want to send me a direct chat message with your address, we can send it to you.
That's awesome.
Yep.
Congrats, Layla. And if there are no further questions, we'll hand it back to you. There's one, oh, that was Layla. Thank you. Suzanne, any closing remarks on the incredibly awesome Sandhill cranes? I love them.
Well, depending on where you are, definitely everybody get out and see them. They're pretty much all over the country, different subspecies. So find your nearest refuge and call them up, see if there's cranes around.
Yeah, when I worked for the, oops. Oh, I thought I was muted there. When I worked for the U.S. Forest Service in the Region 5 outside of San Francisco, there was that I think they call it the Central Flyway. I had the
Or
pleasure of getting up in there to not the Central Valley.
yeah, Central Valley population. Yeah,
Yeah, I
of the
had the
graders.
pleasure, right, of the graders. And I
Hmm.
had the pleasure of getting out to some of the wetlands out there, and I only wished I'd been able to see the cranes, but it was just the wrong time of year. So
Yeah,
uh, good
any
enough.
you can get on to Monte Vista Refuge and not see a crane, depending on the time of day you're there. So it's really important you can go on our montevistacranefest.org site and pull off our crane viewing brochure if you happen to be in the valley. But it's got a lot of information on there. And it's like if you come down the wildlife drive while everybody's out feeding, yeah, you're not going to see a crane on the refuge. So it's good to know that daily life cycle to figure out where to go look for them.
Yeah, exactly. Well, everybody, this has been a wonderful, wonderful presentation. It certainly exceeded my expectations. Man, I know more about
Awesome.
cranes. I hate that I'm going to probably forget some of this, but I'll find you out at the refuge.
Yep. Well,
And
thanks, everyone.
yeah, so for next month, Kelly, we have got Price Heiner in store
Mm.
for the another, let's see, historic trail archaeology. And that's going to be local to the San Luis Valley. And I'm sure he's going to be talking about the Spanish Trail and how historically that fits into the world we live in. I also want to put a plug in for our partners on the Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest who do a very similar program like this called Community Connections. And on October 16th, they're also doing a section on archaeology. So it sounds like October is an archaeology kind of month. I forgot to mention though, ours is on October 23rd, I think. That is a weird number that I have there. Nonetheless, the next session, so look for it on Facebook. You guys will see that then. Following that, we have two more. We are planning on bringing back another section on wolves in December, as long as Colorado Parks and Wildlife is good with coming on. And then before that, though, we have a new speaker that will talk about elk and the history of elk in Colorado. Should be a wonderful session in November.
Hmm.
And with that, I'd like to say, well, thank you for attending, and everybody have a wonderful evening.